Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Sweep Union, and in this one, there are significant developments across the front line. The Russians have managed to advance both in the Kupiansk direction in the northern section of the front line, in the Liman section, both within the Serebrenysky forest area to the north and to the east of the city. The Russians managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the eastern outskirts of that. In turn, the Ukrainians made several counterattacks here to the north of Pokrovsk, where over the past few days, and especially over the past 24 hours, the Ukrainians are significantly strengthening their counterattacks to the north of the city in an attempt to push the Russian forces back across the river line. Starting out in the Kupiansk direction, the Russians managed to control the residential area to the north of the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city. The Russians are slowly pushing through to gain control over the residential areas and siege the apartment complex buildings, both in the lateral and vertical directions. Both of these are very important for the Russian capture of the city. The Russians want to capture everything north of the railway, which would allow them to significantly strengthen their positions in the northern parts of the city, as well as to enter into the eastern parts of the city through the river line itself, and to have control over the strongest points within the city, leaving just a small apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city remaining under Ukrainian control, as well as the school area that are fortified positions that the Ukrainians can make use of, while the remaining residential areas within Kupiansk are just regular houses, which are not very defensible and are very vulnerable to artillery fire. The more of Kupiansk the Russians gain control of, the closer they get to gaining full control over everything east of the Uskar River line, from Hrushkivka in the south to Petropavlivka in the north, and everything in between. In the Liman direction, there are several advances by the Russian forces, both in the direction of the Serbyansky forest area, as well as in the direction of Liman itself. To the northeast of Liman, the Russians continue offensive operations southwest of Mirne along the defensive lines to gain control over the fortifications and the road leading into Sarishne from the northwestern direction, cut off the Ukrainian forces operating within Mirne and the fortified positions in between Mirne and Sarishne. The Russians also managed to advance within Sarishne itself. Although the flag was raised in the western parts of the settlement, it was reported by a Russian source with contact to the soldiers fighting within the town that this was just a flag operation. In reality, the Russians advanced in the central parts of it, and they also report an issue within the settlements that the Russian and Ukrainian positions switch interchangeably, in the sense that the Russians occupy a position where they might have bypassed a Ukrainian position, and that means that there are Russian forces in the west and the east, and there's Ukrainian positions in the center and further to the west. And this means that the areas under Russian control and the areas under Ukrainian control are not definitive, as both sides can end up occupying some of these positions, and they switch hands very often. That means we might have to end up switching the control map up to a gray zone, as we have in other sectors of the front line, where the Ukrainians are continuously launching counterattacks at Russian offensive operations. To the southeast of Sarishne, the Russians managed to gain control over significant portions of the Serbyansky forest area, what remains under Ukrainian control. The Russians are advancing along the Shervets River line itself, where they've managed to cut off the Ukrainian positions here north of the Svetska Donetsk river line, just to the northwest of Serebrenka itself. The positions on the northern bank of the river line have now been isolated through the river line itself, which means that the Ukrainian forces within this southern part are now forced to withdraw to the southern parts across the river line and into the Serebrenka Dronivka direction, which means that they'll be walking out into the open to withdraw from the forest area. At the same time, some of them have already withdrawn to the western parts, which means that they have now been split apart from the different groups that are fighting within the Srebrenysky forest area. With these advances by the Russians within the forest area, it is clear that the majority of the Ukrainian forces have either been defeated or have withdrawn from this direction. and it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it. As we see, the eastern parts of the Srebrenik forest area, just a tiny bit remains under Ukrainian control, and this will likely be captured within a few days. The Russian forces operating within the Srebrenik forest area will then be able to redirect themselves further west towards Liman itself, where they will continue the fighting along the forest patch areas within the Srebrenik forest, but the western bank of the Sherebets River line. At the same time, they can throw in a lot of UAV units that can operate from the Srebrenik forest area, and with this close proximity to Siversk, a lot of them can be deployed in the area to support the Russian forces operating within the town itself and its near vicinity. The Russian forces will be able to strengthen defensive operations in the direction of Liman and Siversk as they continue capturing the positions within the Srebrenik forest area and develop the offensive operations here to the northeast of the Sylviansk-Kostiantinivka line. As for the northern flank of Pokrovsk, there is this Ukrainian counterattack that managed to recapture the positions along the defensive line. They've now secured the positions west of the defensive line, which the Russians had abandoned during the Ukrainian counterattack a few weeks ago. The Ukrainians have now consolidated their positions and used it as a bridgehead to develop the offensive operations further east in the direction of Sachishuk and in the northern flank of Rodinsk. At the same time, they continue to pour troops through Pokrovsk and Mirnorod up towards Novoekonomishne, and they're now developing their offensive operations in the northern direction along the river line itself in the direction of Razine. The positions here within Novoekonomishne, the industrial area, and the fortified positions to the south of it are all in a gray zone, yet the Ukrainians continue to push to try and to eliminate the Russian forces along the settlements along the river line itself, to cut off all of the Russian forces operating on the western bank of the river line itself. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also counterattacking in the direction of Novotoretsk, where they're looking to gain control over the eastern bank of the river line as well. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are launching a very risky maneuver where they're looking to completely cut off every Russian position west of the river line, and they're doing this with a pincer maneuver from the north and from the south. However, this is at the same time as the Russians are storming Pokrovsk itself. They are also launching offensive operations in the direction of Rodinsk. Both of these are regular operations by the Russians that they have been doing over the past few weeks. Now, the Ukrainian operation is to counterattack and cut off the supplies to the northern flank. Securing the northern flank and re-establishing the defensive line along the river line will free up a lot of the Ukrainian forces to counterattack in the direction of Pokrovsk and secure the city. Therefore, the operation is very logical and a very good one at that. However, what makes this a risky maneuver is that they do not have control over the high ground locations here to the north of Mirnorod, and the Russians still have control over many fortified positions. At the same time, they are also very hasty with their behaviors, as they have not yet secured Novoekonomishne, yet they are pushing upwards towards Razine. They have not really completely secured Volodymyrivka and the surrounding areas, yet they are expanding their offensive operations not just towards Novotoretsk, but also towards Pohyvia and Poltavka. The Ukrainians are here launching some risky maneuvers because while they are launching operations with a high and lofty goal, they're not consolidating their positions, and at the same time the Russians are launching their own offensive operations in different sectors of the front line. But this also confirms my analysis from a few weeks ago that the Ukrainian offensive has begun, and it is centered around Pokrovsk, but also spread across the entire Donetsk region. As for the southwestern parts of the Donetsk and into the Dnipropetrovsk regions, it is clear that the Ukrainian reinforcements does not stretch that far. The Russians have managed to restart offensive operations in the direction of Moravka, regaining control over the road between Kotlyarivka and the settlement. As for the southwest, the Russians have gained control over some fortified positions to the east of Novopavlivka, expanding the zone of control within the Dnipropetrovsk region, and they've also managed to kick the Ukrainians out of the Donetsk region here to the north of Novokrainka, as they are securing the flank for offensive operations to regain full control over Dashna. This means the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Novopavlivka on the western flank of Pokrovsk. As for the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians continue storming the defensive lines of the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, as they continue storming the second line of defense, getting control over additional fortified positions on the outskirts of the Donetsk region and to the north of Ternova, flanking the settlement from the northern flank, and fighting over these fortifications, gaining control over additional 4 fortified positions. The Russians also secured the remaining parts of Sosnivka, which allows them to strengthen their positions here in the north of the defensive line and continue gaining control over the settlements along the river lines covering the flank from the northern direction. Russians will then look to gain control over these fortifications north of Sosnivka and push in the direction of Orestopil to gain control of everything south of the Vovcha river line, potentially pushing into Velikomuhailivka or bombarding it completely to prevent the Ukrainians from using it to stage offensive operations in the direction of the northern flank of the Russian forces advancing along the defensive lines. The Russians are getting closer and closer to gaining full control over the second defensive line all the way to the highway, which is one of the main supply lines for the Ukrainian forces within Huliaipole, which is a logistical hub for this sector of the front line, the eastern parts of the Zaporizhia region. The Russians are slowly developing defensive operations here on the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, as well as to the southwest of Pokrovsk in the direction of Novopavlivka, while developments also take place in the direction of Liman and Kupiansk. These are the main sectors for the Russian offensive operations, while at the same time there's been a little less development in the direction of Kostiantynivka itself, as well as Pokrovsk. What we're likely seeing is that the Russians are preparing a response to the Ukrainian counterattack. We'll have to see whether the Ukrainians will succeed in cutting off the Russian forces operating north of Pokrovsk, which will significantly improve the positions of the Ukrainians here in this section of the front line. However, if they fail to achieve this and expend their forces during these operations, it will speed up the Russian capture of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. This was also previously reported a few weeks ago, where the Russian forces, as soon as they reached the central parts of Pokrovsk, were starting to detect convoys and columns of Ukrainian vehicles, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks moving through Pokrovsk itself towards Mirnorod, where they were questioning whether it was going up towards Rodenske or into the east towards Novokondomishne. Now we see that it went to Novokondomishne for these offensive operations in the direction of Razine. This means the Russians were already aware of this operation before it took place. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.